Well, good morning, Trinity friends, and welcome back to our Adult Forum series as we continue our journey looking at the life of King David and his rise and his fall, and both his triumphs and his many misdeeds. So, Scott and I are here today, really kind of at an interesting point in David's life. We went a little out of order last week, and we're kind of going back to cover the ground where kind of Saul passes away as king and David rises to power. And it's an interesting few chapters, to say the least.
To say the least, yes.
So we're actually going to start with the reading that comes with the All Hallows Eve's liturgy in the Book of Occasional Services, and that's the Witch of Endor.
Yes.
Which is a very... I think it's a very unusual story in Scripture. You don't see something like this happening very often. So,
Chapter 28.
Chapter 28. Saul is...
1 Samuel.
Yeah, Saul is anxious about whether or not he's going to be victorious over the Philistines. He knows David's been fighting on the Philistines' side, and he's kind of freaking out. He doesn't know. He knows that God no longer is kind of on his side, so he's seeking some kind of supernatural extra points, I guess, or a supernatural confirmation.
He believes that God has abandoned him.
Right. And so, I love this. You don't often hear the word wizards in scriptures, but, right there in verse 3, Saul had expelled the mediums and the wizards from the land, and I just have these images of, like, Dumbledore and Gandalf being sent packing in the Holy Land. And so he finds this witch. He disguises himself. I mean, this is...
He dresses up because he's expelled them all.
Right. So he's got a reputation for being anti-witch.
Right.
Anti-medium, anti-wizard.
But then he realizes if he's going to figure out why God has abandoned him, he needs one of them to tell him why. Right? Because without God, what access do you have to God? Right?
He's trying to tap into some kind of supernatural power that he knows David has, and he no longer has.
Terror fills his heart, and he's tried to listen to God through dreams, through prophets, through the Urim, which we don't know what that exactly is, but nevertheless, and he says to his attendants, as it says, find me a woman who's a medium, so I may inquire of her. And because he's already passed a law basically expelling them all, he needs to disguise himself.
Right. And so he goes to this woman by night. I'm just trying to imagine what this is like as he kind of knocks on the door.
I wonder how he disguised himself.
Right. How do you not be the king?
Right.
And she thinks he's setting a trap for him, because clearly she has been smart enough to disguise herself and not be expelled. And so she thinks she's been found out.
Right.
Saul convinces her that he's there for legitimate reasons, I guess, and he wants this medium to, as the text says, bring up Samuel for me. So this is the prophet Samuel who's died, and he wants to talk to Samuel again. This was the prophet who anointed him, who also anointed David, but he wants Samuel to talk to him. And I find humor some in the exchange that he has with the soul of Samuel.
Very much.
But one of the things to note, I think, about this that I find interesting is that it reveals, I think, something about the cosmology and the old Jewish view of the afterlife, is that, Samuel is in Sheol. He's in the place of the dead, which is why he has to be brought up.
Right.
So in, kind of elementary Christian ideas, the idea of hell is down below. So, just to be clear that when Samuel's brought up, he's not hanging out in hell, he's hanging out in the place of the dead, which is where all dead people went.
Right.
And so...
Sheol.
So Sheol. And so here we go. There's a divine being coming up out of the ground, the woman says, as she's calling Samuel. And there he appears, and Saul falls down, and then Samuel is mad at him. He's really, really mad at him in verse 15.
Why have you disturbed me?
Right? It's like, you woke me up from the greatest nap in the world. Why have you disturbed me? And Saul he's greatly distressed. He wants to know whether or not he should fight the Philistines or not. And, Samuel's pretty blunt with him.
Right.
He's pretty blunt with him that, things are not going to work out very well
Right.
for him.
Right. No, he says that, this isn't gonna turn out well, right? Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites. The Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will hand over both Israel to the Philistines and you. And tomorrow your sons will be with me.
Oh yeah, that's a
right.
That's a pretty dire.
So tomorrow
warning.
you're all going to be dead. Is what he's.
Yeah. Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned for you and become your enemy? And so he predicts Saul's death, and lo and behold, a couple of chapters later, we see it happening.
Right.
We see it happening.
Right.
I think if I'm in Saul's position, like, do you go fight at that point? If Samuel says you're about to die, or do you? What do you do at that point? Is the die cast and you have no choice but to meet your fate?
If we move to chapter 31, we see that he does go, right.
Right.
He does go to fight. He and his sons.
And the Philistines overtake him.
And the Philistines overtake them, and they first, like the witch says, kill his sons. Jonathan, Abinadab, and Melchi. They kill them, and Saul says to the armor bearer, "Take my life."
Right.
And the armor bearer says, "No, I can't do it."
Right. And so Saul sets up his sword and he falls
sets
on
up his sword and he falls on it. And then that's the end of Saul.
And that's the end of Saul. And so here we have the end of the king of Israel, essentially.
Right.
What's interesting, though, is what happens when David finds out and how David finds out about this. So, Saul's been trying to kill David for so long. They've been at war with one another for so long. Skirmishes, battles, chasing each other down.
Back and forth.
One of the Amalekites finds Saul in the death throes, and
we learned this in the first chapter of 2 Samuel,
and winds up finishing the job, so to speak, speeding his death on.
He comes to David and he says,
he's got the crown, right? He's
got Saul's crown, and he says, "Look what I've got." And David says, "What's happened?" And he says, I came across, I came across Saul, who had fallen on his sword. But it's gruesome. He said, but he wasn't quite dead yet.
Yeah. Images of Monty Python coming.
So Saul says to the Amalekite, "Finish me off."
Yeah. Right.
And the Amalekite says, "No, I can't do it." He says, "Do it." And so he does it. And he takes Saul's crown and he goes to David, and "I'm here to give that to you." And
so again, Saul asks him to do this.
Right.
So it's not like he's vindictively or with lots of anger and malice trying to cause more pain. It's actually kind of being merciful to someone who's dying.
Right.
But David doesn't take it that way.
No. So the Amalekite brings this crown to David, says, "You are now the Lord." And David and his men rend their clothes, the typical action for mourning. They mourn and they weep and they fast until evening for Saul and Jonathan and the army of Israel. And then David turns on the Amalekite, the guy who came to bring him news.
Right.
He says, "Who are you? Where are you from?" And he repeats himself, "I'm an alien. I'm an Amalekite." And David said, "Why are you not afraid of me?" Basically.
Yeah.
And the Amalekite doesn't answer it, and David calls to his men and says, "Now kill him."
Right. So David has this thing, and we see it actually again in a few chapters, where he has this thing where because Saul was one of the Lord's anointed, you're not supposed to mess with him. You're not supposed to kill him. And we saw David spare Saul's life multiple times, so apparently there's something there. Maybe it's his affection for Jonathan, or so. I don't know, but something about anybody raising their hand against someone the Lord has anointed, David has. That is capital punishment. That's a death sentence for anybody.
Now we see this type of thing continue throughout history.
Yeah.
I mean, through all the kingdoms of the world, that there is a specialness about the king.
Right.
We see this throughout medieval Europe and the kingdoms of Europe. the king is special,
Right.
and
Right.
you don't mess with the king. There's something
Right.
bad is going to happen to you
Right.
if you mess with the Lord's anointed.
Which is mind-boggling because David is literally at war with Saul.
Right.
Like,
Right,
how does
but there's something...
how does David think this is going to end?
Right, right.
Like,
right.
you can't have two kings. I have a hard time working my mind around, like, David's logic here.
Right.
Like, there's a part of it that seems really honorable and merciful, but then there's another part of it that's going, you've set people in motion to be at war against a whole people, and
Right.
then when war gets to its logical conclusion, it makes you mad.
Right.
And you're unhappy with that solution. And, part of me, is this just David's way of, like, washing his hands and appearing merciful and getting his way anyway? I don't know. It's just, I can't wrap, maybe it's because I'm not from the time, I guess.
Yeah.
But
Did he hope all along that Saul would finally say, "Oh, okay.
Would they reconcile?
You're now king."
Right.
I mean, what was...
Because he certainly sings his praises, right?
Right. Right. What was that?
Saul and Jonathan, he sings his grieving song. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death, they were never divided.
Right.
They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. And, and everybody weeps over you. The mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. So maybe his feelings towards Saul are, tangled up in his feelings towards Jonathan. I don't know.
No,
I don't know.
knows?
But we see this again here in a couple of chapters, and
Right.
then we'll see it again when David's at war with his son as well. That
Right.
whoever brings the bad news, which I think they thought was good news, that your enemies have been slain, he kills the messenger. He literally kills the messenger.
He literally kills the messenger. Which is where we get the phrase, do not kill the messenger. Yeah, you can't have two kings. I mean, like right now we have two popes, but it ain't working very well.
Right.
I mean...
and the house of Saul is not ended here. So,
no.
Saul and Jonathan are dead, and these other sons of Saul are dead, but Ishbaal is still alive, and he remains king of Israel, and David remains king of Judah. So they're still at war. They're still at war. They're still kind of fighting these battles. And eventually, in a couple of chapters, or in a chapter or so, Ishbaal is assassinated. So he's killed. And then the two people who kill Ishbaal bring his head back to David, and we have the exact same thing happen.
They kill them.
Exactly. So Rimmon and Rechab bring the head of Ishbaal back to David while Ishbaal was sleeping, taking his noonday rest. So he's literally taking a nap, and they stab him in the stomach, and they take his head. We should have put a trigger warning on before this.
I know.
I'll put this in the comments that this is a very violent discussion here. But, and then they bring the head back to David and says, we've avenged you. This person who sought your life, David, we've avenged you by taking Ishbaal and essentially ending Saul's line. And David says, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when the one who told me, see, Saul is dead, thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him. This was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more then when wicked men have killed a righteous man on his bed in his own house? And now shall I not require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth? And we shall not read chapter 4, verse 12, because it does not pass the test of good decorum in the Episcopal Church. This is not the kinds of things we talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But then after that, then David becomes king over both kingdoms. He's king over Judah, and he's king over Israel.
Right.
And so it takes us a long time to get to this moment. David was anointed by Samuel, way back in 1 Samuel, early in 1 Samuel.
Right.
And there's been this constant struggle and war and turmoil and division and violence, and now David finally gets to this point where he is king over both kingdoms, which you have to think maybe had to be part of his plan all along. He was certainly an ambitious man. But his response to his perceived enemies is fascinating. And his love for the house of Saul continues on because, in a few chapters, he goes out and he asks, is there anybody left in the house of Saul that I can I can continue on a relationship with because
Yeah.
of my love for Jonathan. And
Yeah.
so he winds up finding Jonathan's son, who is whose feet have been maimed and he can't walk. And he welcomes Mephibosheth, I think is his name, welcomes him to his table and says, "You'll always have a place at my table to eat." So there's a certain sense of kind of graciousness to that. I can't help but hear his graciousness towards Jonathan's son in his Psalm 23, where he talks about, "I prepare a table, and you prepare a table for me in the place in front of my enemies."
Right.
And for David, it seems like that was also to welcome his enemies to that table, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, very much.
So a very violent and bloody thing. We've gone from witches and mediums and ghosts and assassinations and beheading. I mean, it's just, again, this is sacred scripture.
It is.
It's telling us something about the people of God and something about God. The fact that, even in the midst of horribleness, God can still work purposes out from that, I suppose.
Yeah, I think there's that, and I mean, we could talk about this at length, but once again, there's something here about the sacredness of the story, and that it's not sanitized.
Yeah.
I
Right.
mean, if we
This
would
is not George Washington chopping down the cherry tree thing.
and it's not the type of cultic writing that would. It's not hagiography.
Right.
It's not which you see. I mean, if you want to tell in other religious traditions, you see this. We only tell
the good parts.
the good part of this prophet.
Yeah.
And that's what this whole book is for. We only tell how wonderful this prophet was, and we don't see that here.
We see the awfulness.
We see the awfulness of it, and you don't want to set up a situation where we're saying that we needed the awfulness for God to be God, but there is something about just the honest telling of humanity and who we are as human beings, though we are in the arms of God, is quite compelling, I think.
Yeah. And following on that, this idea of it not being sanitized, that most of what we're reading in here, though it's really gruesome to our ears, it's still happening. I mean, we just had the president of Haiti assassinated, right?
Absolutely.
And it seems to be becoming clear that so many countries and powerful things are involved in that process.
Yeah.
It's not like we're not still seeing this process unfolding in history. So if God is a God of reality, then this has to be part of the sacred story.
Absolutely.
That God is somewhere in that, not in good ways. Maybe God condemning that. But there's something of a comfort to know that our sacred texts don't turn a blind eye to the atrocities of our world and say that those exist, and yet God is still a God of love. And yet, in the end, this violence isn't what wins the day.
Amen. Yep.
Well, friends, I don't know whether to thank you or apologize to you for these stories, but again, they're part of our faith's history, and they're important parts of it. But thank you for being with us today. We will continue this journey next week.
All right. Thanks again.
All right. Bye-bye, y'all.
Take care.